Billionaire's son failed in every test, until the day a black janitor taught him one secret. Hit like and subscribe so we can keep creating the stories you love. The auditorium fell silent as the final answer appeared on the screen. Wrong. Again. 500 pairs of eyes locked onto Ethan Langford as he stood frozen at the podium, his hands trembling against the microphone. The academic excellence competition, his father's pride, his mother's hope, his final chance to prove he wasn't the family disappointment. The silence shattered. Ladies and gentlemen, the moderator's voice echoed through the marble hall. Ethan Langford has scored 0%. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Camera flashes exploded like lightning. In the front row, his father's face turned stone cold, jaw clenched so tight it could crack diamonds. Then came the voice that would haunt Ethan forever, his father's boom across the stage, amplified by the microphone he'd grabbed. "You are a disgrace to this family name." The words hit like a physical blow. Ethan's legs buckled. Whispers erupted from his classmates, cruel laughter from competitors, and the relentless click-click-click of photographers capturing his humiliation for tomorrow's headlines. He ran, down the marble steps, through the lobby where oil portraits of Langford ancestors seemed to sneer at him, past security guards who looked away in embarrassment. His designer shoes slipped on polished floors as he fled toward the empty hallway beyond the auditorium, where silence promised refuge from his shame. Ethan collapsed against the lockers, their cold metal biting through his expensive suit. His fist slammed against the blue steel doors, each impact sending sharp pain up his arms, pain he welcomed because it matched the ache in his chest. "Useless," he whispered to the empty hallway. Completely useless. The soft squeak of rubber wheels on linoleum made him look up. A black man in his 50s pushed a yellow mop bucket down the hallway, moving with the quiet efficiency of someone invisible to most of the world. His navy uniform was pressed and clean, name tag reading Samuel in simple black letters. Samuel's eyes met Ethan's briefly, not with pity, not with judgment, just recognition of another human in pain. "Sorry," Ethan muttered, wiping his face. "I'll get out of your way." But Samuel didn't move on. He parked his bucket beside the water fountain and leaned against his mop handle, studying the young man crumpled against the lockers. "You keep trying to be your father's shadow," Samuel said quietly. "Maybe that's why you can't see your own light." The words hung in the air like smoke. Ethan's head snapped up, fury replacing despair. "What did you say?" "I said. I heard what you said." Ethan pushed himself off the lockers, straightening to his full height. "You don't know anything about me. About my family. About what I'm dealing with." Samuel nodded slowly, wringing out his mop with steady hands. "You're right. I don't know you. But I know that look." "What look?" "The look of someone drowning in other people's expectations." Ethan opened his mouth to snap back, but something in Samuel's voice, the calm certainty, the absence of judgment, stole the words from his throat. "My father expects excellence," Ethan said instead, his voice barely above a whisper. "The Langford name means something. It means everything." Samuel squeezed the mop again, water dripping steadily into the bucket. "What does Ethan Langford mean?" The question hit like ice water. Ethan stared at this janitor, this stranger, who had somehow asked the one question no one else ever had. Before he could answer, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed down the hallway. His mother's voice, calling his name with desperate worry. Ethan straightened his tie and walked away without another word. But Samuel's question followed him home, echoing in his mind as photographers camped outside the family estate and his father refused to speak to him at dinner. That night, lying in his bedroom that was larger than most apartments, Ethan stared at the ceiling and wondered who he would be if he wasn't trying to be Charles Langford's son. The failures came in waves after that. 3 weeks later, Ethan bombed his SATs so spectacularly that his prep tutor, a Harvard graduate who charged $500 an hour, quit via email. The message was polite but clear. "I cannot help someone who isn't willing to help himself." His mother, Victoria, tried damage control over breakfast in their dining room that could seat 20. "Darling, everyone has bad days. Your father had setbacks too when he was my age. He'd already started his first company and made his first million." Ethan interrupted, stabbing at his untouched eggs Benedict. "I know the story, Mom. Everyone knows the story. Charles Langford didn't look up from his Wall Street Journal. The silence stretched like a chasm between them. 2 months later, Ethan was cut from the tennis team at his elite preparatory academy. Not because he lacked skill, he'd been playing since age 4, but because he'd choked during the final qualifying match, double faulting 7 times in a row while scouts watched from the stands. His opponent, Marcus Chun, found him afterward in the locker room. "Dude, what happened out there? You play better than that in practice." Ethan couldn't explain how the weight of being Charles Langford's son felt heaviest when people were watching, how every serve became a referendum on his worth, how the crowd's expectations turned his racket into lead. He quit the team the next day. The tabloids were merciless. "Golden Boy tarnishes," screamed the New York Post. "Langford heir," more like error, punned the Daily News. His father's business rivals delighted in the spectacle, and social media turned his failures into memes. The final blow came during the charity gala season. His mother had arranged for him to give a speech at the Children's Education Foundation. Something safe, something meaningful, something that might restore the family's image. Ethan stood at the podium in the Plaza Hotel's grand ballroom, 200 of New York's elite watching expectantly. His prepared remarks about educational inequality lay before him, words his mother's publicist had crafted with surgical precision. But as he looked out at the sea of faces, some genuinely interested, others clearly there for the spectacle, the words turned to ash in his mouth. "Education," he began, then stopped. The silence stretched uncomfortably long. Someone coughed. A champagne glass clinked against a table. "Education is..." He tried again. Nothing. His throat felt like sandpaper. In the third row, his father's face had gone from expectant to concerned to mortified. His mother's hands twisted in her lap, her smile frozen in place. Ethan set down the speech and walked off the stage without another word. This time, the headlines wrote themselves. "The useless son, Langford heir can't even finish a speech." That night, Charles Langford summoned his son to the study, a mahogany-paneled room lined with first-edition books and photographs of handshakes with presidents and prime ministers. "Sit down," his father said, not looking up from the papers spread across his desk. Ethan remained standing. "I said sit down." The leather chair creaked as Ethan finally obeyed, feeling like a defendant awaiting sentencing. Charles removed his reading glasses and fixed his son with the same stare that had intimidated Fortune 500 CEOs and world leaders. "Do you know what your great-grandfather built this company from?" "Nothing," Ethan answered. He'd heard this story 1,000 times. "Nothing," Charles confirmed. Marcus Langford arrived in America with $12 and a willingness to work 16-hour days. He built Langford Industries with his bare hands because failure wasn't an option. "Do you know why?" Ethan shook his head. "Because he had nothing to fall back on. No trust fund. No family name. No safety net. He succeeded because he had to." Charles leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "But you have everything. And somehow, that's made you into nothing." The words hung between them like a blade. "I'm giving you one final opportunity," Charles continued. "One last test. If you fail this one, I'll remove you from the company succession plan and establish a scholarship fund in your name instead. At least then your trust fund will do some good for people who actually deserve it." "What kind of test?" Ethan asked, though he already dreaded the answer. "A business pitch. To the board of directors. 3 months from now. You'll present a comprehensive strategy for a new division of Langford Industries. Something innovative. Something profitable. Something that proves you understand what it means to be a Langford." Charles put his glasses back on and returned to his papers. "Your mother thinks I'm being too hard on you. I think I've been too soft. We'll find out who's right." The dismissal was clear. Ethan stood and walked to the door, then paused with his hand on the brass handle. "And if I succeed?" His father didn't look up. "Then maybe you'll finally understand what you're capable of." That night, Ethan found himself in the Academy's library long after closing time. The security guard, Mr. Rodriguez, had given him a key months ago, a small mercy for the son of a major donor. The vast room felt different in the darkness, shelves of books casting long shadows under the emergency lighting. Ethan sat at a table buried under business textbooks, management theories, and case studies, but the words swam before his eyes like alphabet soup. He'd been there for hours, learning nothing. The soft squeak of wheels on carpet made him look up. Samuel pushed his cart between the shelves, collecting trash and straightening chairs with the same quiet efficiency Ethan remembered from their first meeting. Working late? Samuel asked, emptying a wastebasket near Ethan's table. Trying to, Ethan replied, then laughed bitterly. Not succeeding. Samuel glanced at the textbooks scattered across the table. Business school. Business pitch. Make or break. Ethan rubbed his temples. I need to present something innovative and profitable to a room full of people who've already decided I'm worthless. Samuel moved to the next wastebasket. What VE you come up with so far? Nothing. Everything I think of has already been done. Better. By people smarter than me. Samuel paused in his work. You know what I learned working 3 jobs to put myself through community college? Ethan looked up, surprised. You went to college? Night school. Took me 8 years, but I got my degree. Samuel's voice carried quiet pride. Accounting. Top of my class, actually. Then why are you? Ethan gestured at the janitor's uniform, then caught himself. I didn't mean. Why am I mopping floors? Samuel smiled. Good question. Turns out a black man with an associate's degree and no connections has limited options, even with honors. So I took the job that was available and made it mean something. He sat down across from Ethan, his hands folded on the table. But that's not the lesson. What is? You don't learn to win by memorizing answers, Samuel said. You win by asking better questions. Ethan frowned. I don't understand. What questions are you asking about this business pitch? How do I come up with something innovative? How do I impress the board? How do I not fail again? Samuel shook his head. Those are the wrong questions. They're about you. About your fear. What should I be asking? What problems need solving? What people are being overlooked? What conversations is your company not having? Samuel leaned forward. I survived poverty by asking better questions. Instead of why don't I have money? I asked what valuable service can I provide? Instead of why won't anyone hire me? I asked what problems can I solve that no one else is solving? Ethan stared at the textbooks, but for the first time, they didn't feel like obstacles. You're saying I should look for problems instead of solutions? I'm saying you should look outside yourself. Your father built his empire by asking what the market needed, not what he wanted to sell. But you're so focused on being him that you've forgotten to see what's right in front of you. Samuel stood and returned to his cart. Sometimes the best view comes from the bottom looking up. You see things the people on top miss. As Samuel moved away between the shelves, Ethan called after him. What do you see from down there? Samuel paused, his back still turned. I see a young man with more potential than he knows, asking the wrong questions because he's afraid of the right ones. The words echoed in the empty library long after Samuel's cart squeaked away into the darkness. The next morning, Ethan didn't go to class. Instead, he walked, not through the manicured gardens of his family's estate or the polished corridors of his academy, but through the city beyond the glass towers and marble facades. He took the subway, his first time on public transportation, and emerged in neighborhoods his driver had always steered around. He asked questions, not about business models or profit margins, but about people. At a community center in the Bronx, he learned about working parents who couldn't afford after-school programs. In Queens, he met immigrants whose professional degrees from their home countries weren't recognized in America, leaving them underemployed and undervalued. In Brooklyn, he discovered artists and inventors with brilliant ideas but no access to capital or connections. For weeks, he kept walking, kept asking, kept listening. He visited homeless shelters and small businesses, community colleges, and job training programs. He talked to janitors and teachers, nurses and mechanics, people his father's world rarely noticed. And slowly, an idea began to form. Not something pulled from a textbook or copied from a competitor, but something born from the voices of people who'd been asking for help while the powerful weren't listening. The 3 months passed quickly. Ethan filled notebooks with research, but more importantly, he filled them with stories. Real stories from real people facing real problems that existing businesses either ignored or couldn't solve profitably. 2 weeks before the pitch, he found Samuel again, this time in the academy's basement, organizing supplies in a storage room that smelled of cleaning products and possibility. I need your help, Ethan said without preamble. Samuel looked up from counting paper towel rolls. With what? My pitch. I think I have something, but I need someone to tell me if it's real or if I'm just fooling myself again. Samuel set down his clipboard. Let's hear it. Ethan pulled out his notebook, pages covered with numbers and sketches and quotes from people whose names would never appear in Forbes magazine. What if Langford Industries created a new division focused on community development, not charity, business? Profitable business that solves real problems for underserved communities. He showed Samuel his research, microlending programs for immigrant entrepreneurs, partnerships with community colleges to create job training programs that fed directly into Langford's workforce needs, affordable housing developments that actually served working families instead of just gentrifying neighborhoods. The profit margins are smaller than traditional Langford ventures, Ethan admitted, but the market is enormous. And more importantly, it's sustainable. These communities have been ignored by big business for so long that there's massive pent-up demand for services that actually work for them. Samuel studied the notebook, flipping through pages of interviews and financial projections. This isn't just about proving yourself to your father anymore, is it? No, Ethan said quietly. It's about proving something to myself. And what's that? That I can be worth something even if I'm not him. Samuel closed the notebook and handed it back. You know what you've done here? Ethan shook his head. You've learned to ask better questions. Instead of how can I impress powerful people, you asked how can I serve powerless people. Instead of how can I be worthy of wealth, you asked how can wealth be worthy of the world. But will it work? Will they accept it? Samuel smiled. That's the wrong question. What's the right one? The right question is, if they don't accept it, what does that tell you about what you need to do next? The boardroom on the 35th floor of the Langford Industries Tower was exactly what Ethan had expected, intimidating. 12 of the most powerful business leaders in the city sat around a table made from a single piece of rare Brazilian rosewood, their faces ranging from skeptical to openly hostile. His father sat at the head of the table, expression unreadable. Ethan, Charles said without warmth, you have 30 minutes to present your proposal for a new division of Langford Industries. The board will then vote on whether your idea has merit and whether you have demonstrated the capability to lead such an initiative. He paused, letting the weight of the moment settle. This is your final opportunity to prove you belong in this company and this family's legacy. Ethan walked to the presentation screen, his notes trembling slightly in his hands. The boardroom felt like a courtroom, and he was very much on trial. But then he thought of Samuel's words, look outside yourself. He thought of Maria, the immigrant engineer working as a house cleaner because her degree wasn't recognized. Of Jerome, the former gang member who'd started a youth mentorship program but couldn't get a business loan. Of Mrs. Chun, whose brilliant teenage daughter couldn't afford college despite perfect grades. Before I begin, Ethan said, setting down his prepared remarks, I want to acknowledge something. Everyone in this room expects me to fail. You've watched me fail repeatedly, spectacularly, and publicly. You have every reason to believe this will be more of the same. Murmurs rippled around the table. His father's jaw tightened. But I've learned something in preparing for today. I've been failing because I've been asking the wrong questions. Instead of asking what problems need solving, I've been asking how to avoid embarrassment. Instead of asking what value I can create, I've been asking how to live up to an impossible standard. He clicked to his first slide. Not a profit projection or market analysis, but a photograph of the community center in the Bronx. So today, I'm going to present a different kind of proposal. Not one designed to impress you, but one designed to serve people this company has never considered worth serving. For the next 25 minutes, Ethan laid out his vision. He shared Maria's story and proposed professional credential translation services. He talked about Jerome and outlined a community-based microlending program. He presented Mrs. Chin's daughter and detailed scholarship initiatives tied to pipeline development. Each proposal was backed by rigorous financial analysis. Not the highest margins Langford Industries had ever seen, but solid, sustainable profits built on genuine value creation rather than market manipulation. The traditional Langford approach, Ethan said, building to his conclusion, has been to identify markets and dominate them. I'm proposing we identify communities and elevate them, not as charity, but as business partners. He clicked to his final slide, projected 5-year revenues and community impact metrics side by side. This division could generate $200 million in annual revenue by year 5, while creating 15,000 jobs and supporting 800 small businesses in underserved communities. The profit margins are lower than our typical ventures, But the market loyalty and social impact create long-term value that pure profit plays can't match. The room was silent. Ethan could hear his heartbeat in his ears. Board member Janet Morrison leaned forward. These are impressive numbers. But how do you know these communities will actually engage with Langford programs? We don't exactly have a reputation for grassroots outreach. Because I asked them, Ethan replied. I spent 3 months in these communities, not as Charles Langford's son, but as someone asking what they needed and whether they'd work with a company willing to provide it. The demand is there. The question is whether we're willing to meet it. Robert Hayes, the most senior board member after Charles, shook his head. This sounds like social work disguised as business strategy. Langford Industries is a for-profit corporation, not a humanitarian organization. With respect, Mr. Hayes, those aren't mutually exclusive categories anymore. Companies that ignore social impact don't just miss opportunities, they become obsolete. Look at the companies dominating markets today. They're the ones that figured out how to align profit with purpose. And you learned this during your tour of the city's poorest neighborhoods. Hayes's tone dripped condescension. Ethan felt the familiar heat of shame rise in his chest, the old instinct to shrink and apologize. But instead, he thought of Samuel's steady voice. Sometimes the best view comes from the bottom looking up. Yes, Ethan said clearly. I learned it from people this company has never bothered to notice. People who work in our buildings but aren't invited to our meetings. People who buy our products but never see our profits. People who know more about creating value from nothing than anyone in this room. The silence stretched taut. Several board members exchanged glances. His father's expression remained stone. Then Janet Morrison spoke again. Walk us through the implementation timeline. For the next hour, the board grilled Ethan on every aspect of his proposal. Market research, regulatory compliance, staffing models, risk management. Questions he would have crumbled under months ago now felt like opportunities to demonstrate the depth of his preparation. Because for the first time in his life, he wasn't defending himself. He was advocating for something bigger than himself. Finally, Charles spoke. Thank you, Ethan. Please wait outside while the board deliberates. Ethan gathered his materials and walked to the door, then paused with his hand on the handle. The room waited for his exit, but something Samuel had taught him made him turn back. I need to say something else, Ethan said. His father's eyes narrowed dangerously. The presentation is over. This isn't about the presentation. It's about something more important. The air in the room grew electric with tension. No one spoke to Charles Langford like this. Not even his son. Especially not his son. I didn't learn any of this from wealth, Ethan said, his voice steady and clear. I didn't learn it from power or position or prestige. I learned it from a man this company overlooks every day. A man with an accounting degree who cleans these floors because the world decided his education and intelligence weren't worth what they'd pay a white man with half his qualifications. Gasps echoed around the table. Several board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. His name is Samuel Washington, and he taught me that asking better questions matters more than having perfect answers. He taught me that the view from the bottom looking up reveals opportunities that the view from the top looking down never sees. And he taught me that proving yourself doesn't mean becoming someone else. It means becoming more fully who you already are. Charles Langford's face had gone pale, then red, then pale again. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely controlled. Are you quite finished? Yes, sir. But I want you to know that whatever you decide in here, I'm going to find a way to make this work. If it's not with Langford Industries, it'll be somewhere else. Because the people I met deserve better than being ignored, and I finally understand that I can be part of giving it to them. Ethan turned and walked out, closing the door behind him with a soft click that seemed to echo through the marble hallway like thunder. He found Samuel in the building's basement, restocking his supply cart for the evening shift. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in harsh white light. How did it go? Samuel asked without looking up from counting disinfectant bottles. I think I either just saved my relationship with my father or destroyed it completely, Ethan said, leaning against the doorframe. Maybe both. What did you tell them? The truth. About the proposal, about what I learned, and about who taught me to ask better questions. Samuel paused in his counting. You mentioned me by name? I mentioned you by name, by profession, and by the fact that this company has been wasting your talents for 15 years. A smile tugged at the corner of Samuel's mouth. That might have been unwise. Probably, but it was honest. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, surrounded by the tools and supplies that kept the gleaming tower functional. Can I ask you something? Ethan said. Sure. Why didn't you tell me you'd been working here for 15 years? That you've been watching me grow up from a distance? Samuel's hands stilled on the inventory sheet. How did you? I asked around. Mr. Rodriguez has been here almost as long, and he remembers when you started. Right around the time I was in elementary school, having my first public meltdowns when I couldn't live up to expectations. Samuel set down his clipboard. What would you have done differently if you'd known? I don't know. Maybe I would have listened to you sooner. Or maybe you would have dismissed me as just another employee who knew your family's business. Samuel's voice was gentle but direct. Sometimes wisdom only lands when we're ready to receive it. You weren't ready before. And now you know that the most important lessons often come from people the world has taught us not to see. Before Ethan could respond, his phone buzzed. A text from his mother. Asterisk, come to the boardroom. Now, asterisk. He showed Samuel the message. Time to find out which future is yours, Samuel said. Want to come with me? Samuel looked surprised. I don't think. I told them about you. If this goes well, you should be part of what comes next. If it goes badly, well, we'll figure that out together too. Samuel studied Ethan's face for a long moment, then nodded. All right, but I'm not changing clothes. Good. I want them to see exactly who you are. The elevator ride to the 35th floor felt longer than usual. Samuel stood quietly beside Ethan, his janitor's uniform a stark contrast to the polished brass and mahogany around them. Neither man spoke, but Ethan could feel the weight of the moment building like pressure before a storm. The boardroom doors opened to reveal the 12 directors still seated around the rosewood table, their faces unreadable. Charles sat at the head as always, but something in his posture had changed. He seemed smaller somehow, less certain. Ethan, his father said. And Mr. Washington. Samuel stepped forward slightly, his chin raised. Mr. Langford, please sit down. Charles gestured to two chairs that had been placed at the far end of the table. As they took their seats, Ethan noticed the shift in the room's energy. The board members who had seemed hostile an hour ago now looked curious, even respectful. Janet Morrison nodded encouragingly. Robert Hayes avoided eye contact, his earlier condescension replaced by something that looked almost like shame. Charles cleared his throat. The board has deliberated on your proposal. Before I share our decision, I need to address something you said about Mr. Washington. Ethan's stomach clenched. Had he just gotten Samuel fired? You're correct that this company has overlooked his qualifications. I've spent the last hour reviewing his personnel file and conducting some overdue research. Charles looked directly at Samuel. You graduated summa cum laude from Queens Community College with a degree in accounting. You passed the CPA exam on your first attempt. You've been managing complex facility operations here for 15 years while simultaneously earning management certifications through continuing education. Samuel nodded quietly. Yes, sir. Yet you've been employed as custodial staff the entire time, with no opportunity for advancement despite repeated requests for interviews in our accounting department. That's correct. Charles was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight Ethan had never heard before. That's unconscionable, and it's about to change. He turned to the board. In addition to voting on Ethan's proposal, we've decided to make some immediate personnel changes. Mr. Washington, we're offering you a position as Director of Community Outreach and Development, reporting directly to whoever heads our new Community Partnership Division. Samuel's composure cracked for just a moment, surprise flickering across his face before he regained control. I appreciate the offer, Mr. Langford. What would the responsibilities include? Working with community leaders to identify partnership opportunities, conducting due diligence on local organizations and small businesses, and developing sustainable relationships that benefit both Langford Industries and the communities we serve. It was exactly what Samuel's experience and education had prepared him for, and exactly what the new division would need to succeed. And the Community Partnership Division? Ethan asked, hardly daring to hope. Charles looked at his son, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time in years. The board voted unanimously to approve your proposal. We're allocating $50 million for the pilot program, with expansion funding contingent on hitting your projected metrics. The words hit Ethan like a physical force. Success. Actual, undeniable success. But Charles wasn't finished. However, we have concerns about your readiness to lead such an initiative independently. The board has decided that you'll serve as associate director, working under an experienced division head while you develop your leadership capabilities. The disappointment was sharp but not devastating. Associate director was still more responsibility than Ethan had ever imagined earning. Who will be the division head, he asked. Charles smiled, the first genuine smile Ethan could remember seeing from his father in years. Mr. Washington, if he accepts the role. The room went silent. Samuel, who had been quietly absorbing the offer of director of community outreach, now stared at Charles with undisguised shock. You want me to head the division? You have the educational background, the community connections, and something more important than either of those, the respect of the people we need to reach. Ethan has the vision and the passion, but you have the credibility. Together, you might actually make this work. Samuel looked at Ethan, who nodded encouragingly. The salary would be commensurate with other division heads, Charles continued, plus equity participation based on division performance. And Mr. Washington, your first task would be to review all custodial and support staff for similar advancement opportunities. I suspect we've been wasting more talent than just yours. I need to think about this, Samuel said carefully. Of course, but I hope you'll say yes, because your new associate director is going to need someone to teach him how to ask the right questions. For the first time since entering the room, Ethan smiled, not because he'd avoided failure, but because he'd found something more valuable than his father's approval, the chance to create something meaningful with someone who'd helped him discover who he could become. 6 months later, Ethan stood in the same community center in the Bronx where his journey had really begun. But now, instead of observing from the outside, he was part of the fabric of the place. The ribbon-cutting ceremony for the Langford Community Partnership Hub was modest by his family standards. No champagne or society photographers, just local residents and small business owners gathering to celebrate the opening of their new resource center. Samuel stood beside him, wearing a suit that fit properly for the first time in 15 years. As division head, he'd thrown himself into the work with an energy that reminded everyone why he'd graduated at the top of his class. The pilot program wasn't just meeting projections, it was exceeding them. You ready for this? Samuel asked, nodding toward the podium where Ethan would soon deliver his remarks. I'm asking better questions now, Ethan replied with a grin. Instead of will I embarrass myself, I'm asking, how can we serve these people better? Good student, Samuel said with mock seriousness. As Ethan approached the microphone, he saw familiar faces in the small crowd. Maria, the immigrant engineer, now working as a certified professional thanks to the credential recognition program. Jerome, whose youth mentorship organization had received its first business loan and was expanding to serve 3 more neighborhoods. Mrs. Chun, whose daughter had received a Langford scholarship and was thriving in her first year at Columbia. But the face that mattered most stood at the back of the room. His father, who had driven down from Manhattan to witness his son cutting a ribbon in a community center most of his peers had never heard of. Charles caught Ethan's eye and nodded, not the grudging acknowledgement of the past, but something that looked remarkably like pride. 6 months ago, Ethan began, his voice steady and clear. I stood in this same room asking questions I'd never thought to ask before. Questions about what problems needed solving and what voices needed hearing. Today, we're not just opening a building. We're opening a conversation that should have started years ago. He gestured to Samuel, who stepped forward to share the microphone. My mentor taught me that the best view comes from the bottom looking up, Ethan continued. That wisdom often comes from people the world has taught us not to see. That asking better questions matters more than having perfect answers. The applause was warm and genuine. Not the polite society clapping he'd grown up with, but the real appreciation of people who'd been heard, finally, by someone with the power to listen. After the ceremony, as the crowd mingled over coffee and pastries donated by local businesses, Charles approached his son. Well done, his father said simply. Thank you. I owe you an apology, Ethan. And I owe Mr. Washington more than that. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching Samuel surrounded by community leaders discussing next steps and new possibilities. You know what I learned watching you today? Charles said. What's that? That maybe the Langford name will mean something different because of you. Something better. Ethan looked around the bustling community center at the lives being changed and the partnerships being forged, and realized that for the first time in his life, he wasn't trying to live up to the Langford name. He was helping it live up to something bigger than itself. "Dad," he said quietly, "there's something I want to ask you." "What's that?" "What does Ethan Langford mean?" Charles smiled, not the corporate smile he used in boardrooms, but the smile of a father seeing his son clearly for the first time. "It means someone who learned to ask better questions. Someone who found his own light instead of hiding in shadows. Someone who proved that privilege becomes meaningful only when it's used to lift others up." Across the room, Samuel caught Ethan's eye and raised his coffee cup in a small salute. The gesture was simple, but its meaning was clear. Asterisk, "Well done, student. You've finally learned to see." Asterisk. As the afternoon wound down and the last visitors filtered out of the community center, Ethan found himself alone with Samuel in the quiet space that would soon buzz with activity. Job training sessions, small business consultations, college prep classes, and a dozen other programs designed to turn overlooked potential into realized opportunity. "So what's the next better question?" Samuel asked, settling into one of the chairs they'd arranged in a circle for tomorrow's entrepreneur support group. Ethan considered this, looking around at the evidence of what asking better questions could accomplish. How do we make sure this isn't just about us? How do we build something that keeps working even when we're not here? Samuel nodded approvingly. "That's a very good question. Any thoughts on the answer?" "Same way you learned to ask better questions in the first place," Samuel said with a smile. "Find people who've been overlooked, listen to what they know, and give them the tools to teach others." As they turned off the lights and locked the doors of the community center, Ethan reflected on the journey that had brought him here. 6 months ago, he'd been the useless son, the family disappointment, the heir who couldn't inherit anything because he'd never proven worthy of it. Tonight, he was something different. A partner in possibility, a student who'd learned to teach, a young man who discovered that the greatest success comes not from avoiding failure, but from asking questions that matter more than the fear of getting them wrong. The tabloids still wrote about him occasionally, but the headlines had changed. Langford Heir's community initiative exceeds projections, and from failure to purpose. A billionaire's son finds his calling. But the headline that mattered most would never appear in any newspaper. It lived in the quiet satisfaction of knowing that privilege, properly channeled, could become a force for justice rather than just comfort. As Samuel had taught him, sometimes the best view really did come from the bottom looking up. And sometimes, if you were willing to look long enough and ask the right questions, you could see clearly enough to help others climb. The Langford name would indeed mean something different now. Not because Ethan had finally lived up to his father's expectations, but because he'd learned to exceed them by serving expectations that were bigger than any one family's legacy. In the end, that was the secret Samuel had taught him. That true success isn't measured by how high you climb, but by how many people you bring with you on the way up. And as Ethan walked into the New York night beside the man who'd saved him from his own limitations, he finally understood what it meant to be worthy of the opportunities he'd been given. The test was over. The real work had just begun. If you made it to the end, please like the video and subscribe to our channel. It truly means the world to us. See you in the next one.